Prontinho, Luísa. Cris, pode começar.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for being here on behalf of the organizing committee of the RDA in Brazil conference. I want to thank you so much. And I also want to thank the committee for inviting me to moderate this table. It's such a pleasure to talk with you. The chairs are yours. The tables are yours.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hello from Canada, and thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this great conference. RDA, especially after the 3R project, is very different looking from cataloging manuals of the past. Today, I'd like to look at some of its features and see how it's well designed as a metadata standard for recording data, bibliographic information, for now and for the future. I'll focus specifically on RDA in the new RDA toolkit, but it is still the same RDA as in the original toolkit. The standard follows the same objectives and principles, and it continues to support the same ways of working as in the original RDA toolkit. There are changes, but these changes are not disruptive. The standard looks different, it has expanded in scope, and it has evolved more fully to achieve its purpose of being an international standard for both current and future environments. Our work in organizing bibliographic information has changed radically over the centuries. And now in the 21st century, the context of our work is quite different in terms of the expectations we have for our bibliographic information. We know that our users do not go out there and look for bibliographic information only at the library, but rather they're out on the web. They're interacting with data in a very broad global context, and they expect bibliographic data to be there as well. So bibliographic data is managed still within traditional catalogs, but more and more it is also managed outside those traditional catalogs. We live in a highly networked environment, and no library is an island. No library stands alone, but rather we are interconnected, and we use each other's bibliographic information no matter where we are, or in what language we catalog. Our metadata should support linking to the metadata of other libraries around the globe. Increasingly, we are also seeing the blurring of lines between cultural heritage institutions. So we expect our metadata to be able to link to and work with the data coming from other communities, such as archives, museums, and publishers. Our metadata needs to be robust enough that it can be harvested. Harvested in the ways in which we expect it to be used, but also in the ways in which we did not think about. The idea is that our metadata will be reused in many new and different ways, and it should lead to the creation of new knowledge and new kinds of applications. RDA Resource Description and Access does not present itself as a cataloging manual. In the new RDA toolkit, we see that RDA is defined as a package of data elements with guidelines and instructions on how to record those elements. It's a standard that comes out of the library community, but it's not intended exclusively for library resources. Rather, it explicitly says that it will enable one to create metadata for library resources, but also for resources from other cultural heritage domains. RDA supports the creation of metadata that can be used in traditional catalogs, but at the same time, it also supports the creation of metadata that can be used in linked data applications. I'd like us to look at two particular aspects of RDA. RDA as a standard that can be used in current and emerging technological environments, a standard that can be used now but also prepares us for the future, and also at RDA as an international standard, a standard that's in the process of being intentionally internationalized. Internationalization also prepares us for a future where we can easily share data and metadata work around the globe. So we'll start by looking at RDA as a standard for use with current and emerging technologies. In the early days of library catalogs, in the days of book catalogs and card catalogs, we recorded strings of characters. And the sole purpose for the strings of characters was that a human would read and interpret the information. Toward the end of the 20th century, as we started to put these strings of characters online, we could see the tremendous potential, but also the pitfalls. Computers did not necessarily understand the context and the structuring for these strings of characters. The information was not structured as data that was suitable for machine processing. And one of the most important things that RDA has done has been to make us look at our bibliographic information and think of it as data. So yes, it's important that it's understood by a human being, but it also can be understood and processed reliably by a computer. RDA is a package of data elements, and that element set also provides the underpinnings for data interoperability. And while an important aspect of RDA is that it is optimized for linked data environments, there's also the recognition that there are many different kinds of libraries working in many different kinds of technological environments. And therefore, a standard has to have the flexibility so that it can be used in whatever technological environment the library works in. So if we go back to that definition of RDA, RDA is a package of data elements. And that's a deliberate choice of words. Data elements are intended to be understood by humans, but also to be suitable for processing by computers. We all rely increasingly on the reuse of our bibliographic data. We rely on managing our bibliographic data through software, through programming in various applications. I think we all recognize that we have an increasing reliance on machine processing, but we also recognize that machines need good, reliable data in order to produce results that are useful. The data elements in RDA are precise and granular. Each data element has a tightly defined scope, so there's only one kind of data in each data element. Thus, you have unambiguous data. Also, each data element is precisely labeled. At this point, RDA has over 3,000 elements to describe 13 different entities. The data elements are precisely defined, and that makes them suitable for machine processing. The data elements also provide the basis for interoperability. RDA users, wherever they find themselves around the globe, all share the same element set. They don't all have to use exactly the same elements, but the elements that they do use all come from the same element set, and so they share the same data structure. And that provides an inherent consistency and compatibility. In addition, there are also controlled vocabularies that can increase interoperability, and these vocabularies are openly published in the RDA registry. By having definition and structure for our data, it also makes it a lot easier to map to RDA, to data that does not come from RDA, that comes from another cultural heritage domain, such as the museum community. The structure for the RDA elements is based on IFLA LRM, the IFLA Library Reference Model. RDA has an explicit and well-defined underlying framework or model that gives structure to the 3,000 plus elements. This structure comes from its close alignment with IFLA LRM. And this in turn also increases the basis for interoperability because IFLA LRM is an internationally accepted bibliographic conceptual model. So the structure underlying RDA is easily recognizable. But also, if there is another metadata standard also aligned with IFLA LRM, by both being aligned to the same bibliographic conceptual model, that also provides a reliable degree of interoperability. RDA is designed to be flexible. There are 4 different recording methods when you record data in a data element. Now, not all 4 methods are applicable to every single data element, but what is important is the principle of 4 recording methods, and they do appear at every single element, because this reflects the fact that libraries operate in different technological environments, and thus each library chooses the recording methods that are most suitable for their own environment. For example, I can use an unstructured description. I'd be using an unstructured description when I transcribe information from a title page, or if I were using an automated data capture method to scrape information off an online representation of a title page. And my result is a string of characters. So it's very good for a human being because we can decipher and understand what's there. But we all know from experience that keyword searching is not always that reliable and that useful. We know the computer does not necessarily process a string of characters very effectively. At the other end of the spectrum, there is another recording method, the Internationalized Resource Identifier. This is an internet standard that's particularly well suited for the linked data environment. It's a globally unique identifier, and I can use it, for example, to record the name of a person. And the result is a machine-readable string. Now, a human being cannot necessarily decipher and understand it, but on the other hand, a computer can process it very effectively and can also pull back information that a human can decipher and understand. So the IRI can lead not just to the name of that person that I recorded, but also to a large amount of information related to that person. It can also connect to other information that is linked to that same IRI, and thus it can expand the potential for exploration. And I wanted to show you an example to show you that this is really actually possible. So here is the example at the data element where we see a metadata statement that is composed of 3 IRIs. So we have the IRI for the person, we have the IRI for the place, and we also have the IRI for the relationship between the two of them, has country associated with person. So these kind of examples are already beginning to be seen and used. But we're not all ready to plunge into linked data environments, and many will continue to record RDA using traditional MARC formats. We know that MARC formats are not well suited for recording entities and properties, or entities and elements, nor for recording the full range of relationships that exist between entities. That's been a challenge since day one of RDA. What is interesting to note is that there have been advances to create viable alternatives to MARC, such as BibFrame and Share VDE. So RDA in MARC may not be ideal, but using RDA, especially RDA in the new toolkit, starts to reorient our thinking in terms of data elements, relationships, the possibility of using an IRI. It starts to get us ready for the future. RDA allows one to create metadata that can be used in traditional catalogs and also for the web and linked data environments. By using the RDA element set, one can create data that's well suited for machine processing or automated processing, and it also supports technical interoperability. Now let us look at RDA from the perspective of a standard that's being intentionally internationalized. RDA has many evident features that mark it as an international standard. For example, it's aligned with IFLA standards such as the International Cataloging Principles and the IFLA Library Reference Model. It's a standard that's in use in countries around the globe, and it's in the process of implementing a governance structure to promote international participation. Translations and the translation process are an integral part of the standard, and translations are very visible in the RDA toolkit. A particularly interesting aspect of RDA is the second point on this slide. RDA, especially after the 3R project, has opened up space for accommodating different local traditions and the needs of different cataloging communities around the globe. So RDA, we know, is aligned with international standards, as I'd mentioned, the International Cataloging Principles and IFLA LRM. There's also a statement within RDA about its relationship to other international standards. And one example would be that metadata created according to RDA can be stored in different recognized encoding schemes, such as MARC 21 or RDF. Oops. Sorry about RDA is considered an implementation of IFLA LRM. And I put up this slide for those of you who may not be familiar with IFLA LRM, and there are links to further explore these bibliographic conceptual models. Now, IFLA LRM is the model that consolidates, but also very importantly supersedes the three previous models, FRBR, FRAD, and FRSAD. And I'm sorry, I keep on losing my cursor off the advancing thing. Sorry. Okay, so RDA's alignment with IFLA LRM is a key defining feature of the standard. IFLA LRM was developed through international cooperation and consensus building, as well as going through a worldwide review. Thus, it comes to represent an internationally accepted understanding of the structure of bibliographic data. And so RDA is based on this internationally accepted understanding. And IFLA LRM provides the basic structure for the content of RDA. It provides the logical consistency and the coherence. And RDA also inherits the built-in focus on the needs of the end user through the user tasks, through IFLA LRM's definition of the relationships between bibliographic data and the successful completion of the user tasks. One of the things that intrigues me about RDA is that it's an international standard that does not expect everybody to do the same identical thing. It's not a case of one size fits all, but rather the focus is on the common ground that we share. The focus is on data interoperability. These are the words of Gordon Dunsire, who was a former chair of the RDA steering committee and a lead architect for the 3R project. And in his words, he says, RDA is designed so that metadata can be created to meet the interests of local communities within a global framework for interoperability. The basis for interoperability is the shared element set. And of course, an additional basis for that interoperability is the fact that the data shares the same structure as the internationally accepted model, IFLA LRM. We can see this focus on interoperability right in the text of RDA. There are a series of objectives and principles in the introduction to RDA that govern the design of RDA. And in the new RDA toolkit, we see a new objective has been added, internationalization. The internationalization objective focuses on data harmonization. In the words of the objective, the emphasis, the metadata provided by different agents will not necessarily be identical. The emphasis is on data harmonization rather than strict compatibility. RDA intentionally accommodates variations. IFLA LRM provides the basic structure for the bibliographic data, and then RDA provides a very large element set, and the metadata creator has the option to choose the precise data elements that they need. Then there are also choices on how to record the data in the 4 different recording methods. There are options about which instructions to use. One can also choose which controlled vocabularies are most appropriate for one's own community. And there are also options on how to punctuate and in what order one puts the elements in. So a cataloging community makes the choices that suit their needs within this framework for interoperability. I'll show you just a quick example about options when using controlled vocabularies. If I'm recording data and I've chosen to use the structured description method, one of the ways to record that structured description is to use a term from a controlled vocabulary. So there are often throughout RDA instructions on using an RDA vocabulary, controlled vocabulary. And in the new RDA toolkit, the controlled vocabularies are called vocabulary encoding schemes. So we can see that, that instruction is there, but immediately following that instruction, there is always another option that one can follow, and that is to choose another suitable vocabulary encoding scheme. And to show you that this is in fact true, I'm going to show you an example from the text of RDA. And here we are at the instructions for broadcast standard. So you can see that the first instruction is given, record an appropriate term from the RDA broadcast standard vocabulary encoding scheme. But immediately following it, there is another instruction that says one can choose another suitable vocabulary encoding scheme. And so it's up to that cataloging community to decide which vocabulary encoding scheme are they going to use in their community? There are also examples within RDA which show the use of terms from vocabulary and encoding schemes that are not RDA vocabulary encoding schemes. And here we see 2 examples. Since RDA offers so many choices and options, it's very important for a cataloging community to record its decisions and to communicate those decisions to its members. There are options to do that right within RDA, which can be very convenient for a frontline cataloger who is using the RDA toolkit. There are policy statements that have their own tab in the RDA toolkit, but that can also be made to show in parallel with the relevant instruction. There is a whole section of documents, and there are many categories of documents, one of which is the application profile. And a cataloging community may have many documents and may have many application profiles for different types of content or carrier. There's also a new section that's being developed called Community Resources, and it is still under development. But it's an interesting section because it adds the possibility of including terminology, guidance, instructions that are specific for a particular language community or a particular specialist community, rather than being international in scope, but they're compliant with RDA. So that's an interesting place to watch for continued development. So there are places right within the toolkit that different cataloging communities can record their decisions, but of course documentation can also exist outside the toolkit. As an international standard that is in use around the globe, RDA has been translated into several languages. In the original RDA toolkit, there were 8 full translations, and new versions of most of those translations are being prepared right now for the new RDA toolkit. And there are also new translation projects underway, such as the Arabic translation, which would be the first non-Roman script in the RDA toolkit. There are also language versions in the RDA registry. These are partial translations. That means the names of the elements and the controlled vocabularies are translated, as well as the definitions, but the instructions are not translated. And there are currently 14 language versions in the RDA registry. What is interesting to note is the way that English is treated. English is not treated as if it's the dominant language and then there are translation, but English is referred to as one of the language versions. Now, English is slightly different because, of course, it's always a starting point for any translation, but it is deliberately called a version. So what I find very interesting is the seamless integration of all the language versions into either the RDA toolkit or the RDA registry. And this results in a high visibility for all the different language communities that use RDA. One can see all the different languages that are available, and you get the sense, you become conscious of the fact that wherever we are around the globe, we're all using the same element set. We're all using the same vocabularies as we create our metadata in our own linguistic communities. So RDA has been designed to be easy to use by metadata creators around the globe. But it's also a standard that should be maintained and developed jointly with representatives from all regions of the globe. And for that reason, RDA governance intentionally incorporates representation from all regions so that everyone around the globe is involved in decision-making and management. The RDA board has had a representative from the region of Latin America and the Caribbean since 2017. And your participation has had a noticeable impact on our decision-making and our strategic planning. Your region is in the process of forming a regional representative body, and once that body is officially approved, then a metadata expert from this Latin American body will join the RDA steering committee and shape the development of RDA, and we are certainly looking forward to that. RDA, especially in the new RDA Toolkit, is a standard that challenges us to think in terms of both now and the future. As an international standard, RDA does not demand that we produce identical data, nor is there any expectation that we will make the same choices. Rather, there's the recognition that we operate in different contexts, wherever we find ourselves around the globe. We may be in different technological environments. We may be operating in different linguistic communities. We may be meeting the needs of different national and cultural communities. They may be communities within the library world or in other domains. But our common interests have always been to provide data that meets the ends of our end users. And we rely increasingly on data that can be processed accurately by computers. And what is most important is the compatibility of bibliographic data across communities, data that can be shared, that can be reused, and that can be integrated with data being produced by other communities around the globe. RDA enables us to achieve this compatibility by providing us a framework for interoperability. So I thank you very much for this opportunity to share these thoughts with you, and I look forward to discussion and questions.
Hi, Chris. That was a great presentation. Thank you so much. Extremely informative. We do have a couple of audience questions, and I have so many questions of my own. I might do a little editorializing of the audience questions, but I do want to I don't know how much you know about cataloging in Brazil. I do want to contextualize that as a country, we are an ACR2 shop, ACR2 and Mark 21, right? And I hope that will give a little bit of context to some of the questions that are coming in and some of the questions that I have. I'll start with one of my own because it's just the two of us, as far as I can see. So I will be extremely narcissistic and just like, let me ignore the over 220 people that are watching us and the questions that are flowing in on my side and just start with one of my own questions. And my question is about this increasing efforts of internationalization of RDA. Right? It's expensive. This has actually come up in our first RDA in Brazil conference. This was actually a talk given in, when was it? I think that was 2019. I might be mistaken. And the thesis of that talk was actually, is it worth it resource-wise for us Brazilians to convert to RDA? If you look at the resources necessary, you need to buy RDA, you need to translate RDA, you need to convert your data. It is expensive. And so I'm wondering what RDA is thinking about how to attenuate those, that type of financial stress for third world countries like Brazil.
That is certainly a question. The first thing is that it is much more effective price-wise to go in as a consortium and there is consortium pricing for subscriptions to the toolkit. And I think that makes a big difference. I think it's Sweden that, in fact, they bought a subscription for the whole country, for all the libraries. That's not necessarily feasible, depends on the politics in a particular place, etc., etc. There is a recognition that different libraries find themselves in different financial circumstances, trying to find different kinds of business models, but it is to have a web tool is a very it has been a very sort of development intensive period, and in fact the RDA fund itself would not have been able to do as much. It's had a lot of support from the American Library Association to help us get there, and we will eventually be paying them back and everything. But they have they were absolutely instrumental in allowing the developments to go forward with the sort of the recognition that we need to go forward. One of the problems with ACR2, of course, is that it's a dead standard. The copyright holders of ACR2 stopped work on it completely, and it's never going to be updated. There's a lot of the way we worked in ACR2 that is possible to continue. But what's probably the most important thing was the way that RDA is meant to orient us towards the future. Yeah. And so we talk about optimized for linked data environments, and it may seem so far way off, but it's actually coming a faster. I sort of think of, attending, certain conferences this year compared to last year, and already there's, so many, steps forward compared to, 5 years ago. It's just, it is quite mind blowing. So we're seeing an acceleration towards that. And it's a question of getting our bibliographic data out there. I mean, yes, we could continue to exist but one of the problems with ACR2 and with the MARC format especially is that it puts us in a silo, and our data doesn't get out there, and our data needs to get out there because users don't sort of get out on the web and say, oh, yep, this is library related, I better go to my library. They just search. Yeah. And they're not going to find us, and they're not going to find our data if we don't get it out there. And so that's part of the whole thing with RDA is let's get out there on the web. We do great stuff in libraries. We do excellent work on describing resources and, the authority of control for persons and corporate bodies. We do amazing work, but let's get it out there and share it, and you have people use that data, and it also makes libraries much more visible, and will make also metadata creators more visible. So it's sort of thinking more about this investment for the future.
Yeah. On that note, I'll run into Nadia's next question, just trying to organize them here. Okay. So I'm kind of going to match two questions, one by Cláudia Faria and one by Carolina Cândido Pereira. And what are the main challenges to implement RDA? And also, what are the main challenges for us to get into this and our current, scenery? Scenery is not the word. I'm literally translating Portuguese right now.
Yeah. Scenario, let's say.
Thank you so much. Our current environment, and what would be some of the challenges that you think we will face on a short and long scale?
Well, it's interesting because if you are you won't have to go through the original toolkit. You could go directly to the new toolkit, which is a very interesting situation and is not something that, of course, I'm familiar with because, as a cataloger, I had to sort of bring along, colleagues through and teach them the original toolkit, and then there'll be the new toolkit. So in some ways, it's quite interesting because you would go directly, to the new toolkit, which it could be a great advantage because there's a lot more openness and flexibility. It was interesting because it was the Germans coming on board with the development of RDA that started really making us see, oh my goodness, yeah, we do it this way, and there's no way in the old RDA that we could accommodate certain things that were very important for the Germans. Let's say in terms of how they described their serials, they wanted to do latest entry, and RDA said, successive entry, and how to reconcile these things. And that's part of the thing that was pushing towards saying, yeah, but it's the elements that count, and the focus on the data elements rather than the actual practices. So in some ways, it could be almost easier because you could preserve practices that are important in Brazil and fit them within the data element set. The biggest challenge, not really challenge, it's just a chunk of work that would need to be done is, well, yes, there's a question about how to translate. Do you do a full translation or do you do a partial translation? If you do a partial translation, it's a lot faster. It may be possible that, the Spanish speaking community will create a Spanish version, and maybe that's a language that's easy for people to flip in and out of. I know that in the Netherlands, for example, they translated only the RDA, what's called RDA reference, which is the elements and definitions and vocabularies, and they use the English for instructions. The Swedes this time have also decided they did a full Swedish translation, but this time with the new toolkit, they're not going to do a full translation. They're going to use English instructions and follow. So it's interesting. You can do some sort of combination. You're not committed to having to do the whole thing all at once. The usefulness of doing something like translating the element set and the control vocabularies, it gives you this multilingual equivalence. All of a sudden, people know what a term is in Portuguese because, oh yeah, that maps to the same identifier, which is, oh, I can read it in Greek, I can read it in English, I can read it, in whatever language. So that also is a nice way of sort of, connecting to the rest of the world. And the RDA reference is always the first step in translation. So one could always, start that and then decide whether to go for full or not in the future. And where did now I've lost the thread of your original question. Have I answered it or
so
not?
Because I joined like multiple questions in one just for my own, but it ended up screwing you over. So are the main challenges of implementing RDA, and then just like the challenges that we already overcome to get where we are right now, and then what are the foreseeable challenges just as like RDA in general.
So the challenge would be, so assuming that you've got, that you've made the decision to use RDA, is then having making the decisions about the elements you're going to use, the recording methods you're going to use, the vocabularies you're going to use, and recording those somewhere where you can share them. Now, from my personal perspective, I think the broader the community that can share the same decisions, the easier it is for everybody. And so, you have many very different kind of examples. The Germans, for example, the German-speaking countries, for example, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, they cooperate very closely and share, well, A, the translation, B, the all their decisions for how they're going to use RDA. In the United States, we have, the Library of Congress and the Program for Cooperative Cataloging. They're going to be making decisions, but we know that it's not just North America that's going to follow them. There's going to be a lot of countries around the world that follow them. And so it's a question of how broadly, you define your cataloging community. So it's a nice challenge. That's an interesting challenge. Define your cataloging community. Getting oriented to thinking differently. That's the biggest, probably the biggest step in RDA. Now, if you walk into the toolkit right now, it's hard to use because you need a map. And that's where a cataloging community's application profile, for example, would tell you, okay, the first thing you need to do is you're going to record, you're going to make a decision about how you transcribe. Then you're going to go and look for your title proper. Here's the title proper element. Here are the instructions. And so that makes it a lot easier. So having made RDA much more flexible, you also need a map through it. And that's where the community decisions are so important. But on the other hand, it also means that you can still identify with your community, regardless, of where you're cataloging around the globe.
I'm really glad you talked about application profiles, because I think that is an important part to sorry, my brain is stuck in Portuguese. So
yeah, that's fine.
But just to make a note of, I do have a question from Caio Batista da Silva about vocabularies, asking if you could explain them a little bit more. From what they understand, they're created by a community inside RDA and might be interoperable databases inside RDA. So just wanting a bit of clarification about that.
No, the RDA vocabulary encoding schemes are created and approved by the RDA steering committee. So there's only one for broadcast standard. There's only one for carrier terms. There's only one for content terms. But other people might have other vocabularies that they want to use. Now, they have to think in terms of, are they a suitable encoding scheme? Do they really match the data element that I'm going to use it in? So one has to be, careful there. But, for example, you could be somebody who catalogs in a library with resources for people with print disabilities who are blind, let's say. So RDA, for example, has an accessibility element, but has no vocabulary with it. So a community might want to say, okay, but we need a vocabulary there. We need a control vocabulary there. And another community might say, oh, well, yes, that's a good vocabulary, but doesn't match exactly our needs. We're going to create another one. And that would be okay. And likewise, RDA might have a vocabulary for broadcast standard, but there might be people who are doing audio recordings, archives of audio recordings, who would have a much more detailed vocabulary that would be appropriate for them to use. So it would have to match carefully with the RDA element where it's supposed to be recorded, but the other vocabularies would be created outside of RDA. The community resources is a little bit of a different thing. That wouldn't be where vocabulary encoding schemes are necessarily. But I'm really there. This part is under development because not only does it need to be developed, but the RDA steering committee has to figure out how's it going to be controlled. And because it's not going to be their content, it's going to be the content of cataloging communities. So that's why I'm saying watch that area, watch developments there, because it will be very interesting to see how that option is used,
So could you talk a little bit about the relationship between community resources and application profiles? Because one assumes that language communities, specialty communities would create their own application profiles. Like the book art community, they will create an application profile for book art as well as having other resources.
Yeah, an application profile is quite precise because it's usually going to be for a particular kind of content. It's going to be for a particular kind of carrier. So it's a very precise and granular tool, and as I was mentioning, a cataloging community is likely to have multiple application profiles depending on what one is cataloging. The community resources, I think, is going to be a little bit more, how can one say, a little bit more general kinds of information. So yes, they do talk about the word, they use the word terminology there, but it's not like a vocabulary and coding scheme, I don't think, in there. Because we don't have any content really there, what has happened, there is a little bit of content in the community resources, and it's basically stuff that was carried over because one of the commitments was in moving from ACR2 to RDA was not to leave stuff behind. But there's stuff in there that's really only applicable to the Anglo-American cataloging community. One of them was Books of the Bible. Well, the way we name Books of the Bible is completely different. And obviously the French have their own lists, the Germans have their own list. So we started having these various different lists for the books of the Bible. And then it was, it was seen as, well, it doesn't really even belong in RDA. That's just so much a cataloging community's decisions. We're going to use this particular list when creating access points for particular books of the Bible. So it's more that kind of thing. There's a question of, how useful will it be? People may find that they would much rather do documents that are not part of community resources. But there is the idea that if something is compliant with RDA, it could have a place there as long as somebody takes ownership and says, we're going to look after this content and we're going to have it there. It has higher visibility than a document. And so that might be the advantage of using that way. As I say, right now, a lot of the stuff that was in the appendices of ACR2 that only really applied to an Anglo-American perspective has made its way into that. But that's why they're looking at how does this go forward when different cataloging communities start to use it.
So we have a question here that I think it's particularly interesting, mostly because I want to sneak in a little question of my own after it. So I'm like, ooh. So, Ana Carolina Siminato Arakaki, sorry, Anna. She asked that with the new RDA, so what would be the best metadata schema to use with it? So Mark, and kind of talked about this a little bit, like Mark 21, BibFrame, ShareVDE, or does RDA provide its own schema? Or is there other possibilities?
Oh, I'm sure there's other possibilities. I mean, the ones I'm familiar with are those, and it really depends on what your system will allow you to use to encode. My personal feeling is if you've got the possibility of not using Mark, it would be great, but it's always this translation and going back and forth and sharing data. And it's interesting because the Library of Congress, of course, always states that this is one of their greatest challenges is they want to create data in BibFrame, but they still need to create MARC records that they share with other people. And it's the going back and forth between them where because of they have totally different structures, it ends up, losing data. So one has to think in terms of how is one going to use that data after creating it. Things like, ShareVDE and BibFrame are much closer because they're sort of following element sets. Now, ShareVDE is even closer to RDA. If one ever played with RIMF, RDA in many metadata formats, that was it's not a viable encoding standard. It was just, meant as a kind of RDA editor to help people understand RDA. But it was so easy because you had a data element and you just recorded the data. It was so much easier than a mark format. Okay, what indicator am I using? What subfield? Do I need punctuation and everything like that? So it really is a question you need to look at in terms of where's your data going after you record it. In your particular context. But obviously, the newer ones are, I think, going to be easier. And I will say, yes, that when we were first implementing RDA, I would talk about RDA, and then I'd say, okay, now you have to do somersaults and fit into the mark format. And so, yes, go ahead.
Well, sorry, no. Well, because this kind of fits into a thing that I'm curious about when you talk about RDA, and to quote you, because you said in the presentation that the data elements are precise and granular, right? And when you compare IFLA, LRM to other entity models, you can see that there are inconsistencies and incompatibilities, and there is semantic loss. And I'm just kind of wondering, where do you stand on that when we, put RDA into BibFrame or ShareVD because of that, those incompatibilities and semantic losses because of the granularity of RDA?
Yeah, I'm hoping that as we get more and more systems, because one of the things that the MARC community has been very good about is that within the limits of MARC 21, here I'm talking MARC 21, and within the limits of MARC 21, they have tried really hard to create the circumstances under which we can create metadata, record it in a granular way, even though it can't be used, and it's sort of for the future. So yes, I mean, I am, I maintaining the granularity is extremely important, and losing that is, is something to, of great concern. And I think that's why, BibFrame had to go through iterations to have enough levels and end up, having the entities that it needed, because it started with too few entities and it just wasn't going to work. But it's good because it came out of the community of practice saying it ain't going to work, fix. And so it's remodeled closer and closer. And it was interesting to see a presentation. I think it was this summer where somebody from Share VDE was comparing the concept of work, in RDA versus, what happens in BibFrame, what happens in Share VDE.
I think I know that presentation. Sophia something or other, but
it was good. It was a good presentation, right?
Yeah. But so kind of on that vein, just because we're talking about BibFrame and Share VDE, Leticia asks us just kind of how RDA is currently being used, to your knowledge, to insert libraries into this linked data environment.
Well, the Scandinavian libraries are really moving ahead. So Sweden, I think the National Library of Sweden is working in a BibFrame linked data environment and using RDA. Now, one of the things we know for sure is that, just like with MARC 21, there's going to continue to be developments that make it, refine, more granular and stuff like that. But there are libraries that are already beginning to do this and use it. And a lot depends on, what are your capabilities in terms of having a library management system that interacts with this sort of linked data exploration and discovery layer. And so I know that, you know, when the Scandinavian countries were looking at RDA initially, when it first was published, that was one of the reasons why they decided not to continue working on their own national cataloging codes, but to start implementing RDA because they wanted to get to linked data. They really saw this is the future. We're going there. So we're going to implement RDA so we can do this. And so yeah, it's not an easy path because, you know, for example, I work as you know, head of metadata at University of Ottawa. We're part of a consortium. We use a particular, you know, library management system or platform, but you know, there are limits to what we can do. You know, I have to, you know, work within my consortium in terms of, you know, what I can use. So we're still in a MARC environment, even though I'd love to be using something else. As an RDA fan, I'd love to be using something else.
So I'm just going to throw you some softballs because we are at the hour mark and I don't want to take more of your time, but I don't know. So these are softballs.
Don't worry.
One of them is just kind of how RDA, and especially RDA in a linked data environment, is being taught in North America.
Well, it's an interesting thing. We have got because teaching it in a library program is always the most challenging. The rest of us who work in libraries, we are so used to dealing with people who have been using the previous standard. And so we keep on doing this stuff of, you know, compared to the old, this is how you do it in the new. But then you think about a new student who arrives, doesn't have that background, can start, you know, completely new and fresh. And how does that get done? There was a very interesting presentation quite recently. You can get it if you go to the RDA Toolkit site. That, you know, is just the general site, not the toolkit itself, but that general site, and look at their recent webinars. There was one, it was Mei Chan, and I think her name is Elise Zhe, on teaching RDA, how they taught RDA at the University of Toronto iSchool. And as a result of that, the RDA steering committee has actually appointed somebody to act as education and training coordinator to give that perspective, because all the people on the RDA steering committee are seasoned metadata creators, and they don't have that sort of like, oh, what's it like when you come to it new? And so it is extremely important, that whole perspective of how do you teach it when you've got new students with no background. And it is very interesting. And it's going to be, and it is now, you know, the fact that they've appointed Elise for a one-year term as the education officer, or whatever they call it, or education training officer, just highlights that, yes, this is an important focus, and the RDA steering committee is, you know, is devoting, you know, attention to this, because it's a very interesting challenge.
Which I think this kind of fits into another softball. So this dichotomy between like fresh eyes to RDA and maybe old eyes, which always kind of compares it to ACR2 or how things were previously done. Ellen Toolsy asks you just kind of how RDA is currently being used in Canadian libraries. And I'm curious if just from the cataloger's perspective, but you can just talk about it in general.
So because because Canada is a small country, and we sit north of the United States, which is a powerful generator of metadata, a lot of Canadian libraries tend to stay in step with what's happening in the United States. So the United States has not yet implemented the new RDA toolkit. So we will probably implement at the same time, even though our own Library and Archives Canada are creating have their own policy statements. But Canada also cannot implement the new RDA toolkit until it's available with the French translation. So translation is advancing, but we can't do anything until the French translation's there, because we have a lot of institutions that are bilingual, and so by law are required to provide the tools to their employees in both languages. But there is also the fact that Library and Archives Canada also watches quite carefully what the Library of Congress and the Program for Cooperative Cataloging are doing in terms of their policy statements and decisions. So, just because we are all working still in a MARC environment, and therefore we need that more identical kind of interoperability of the old days, as opposed to what we can look forward to in the new days in the future. And so we're there. Most I think all Canadian universities are using RDA, and most large research libraries, a lot depending on small public libraries, depends on, because a lot of them don't have their own catalogers. They get their metadata provided with the book that they buy, so it depends on who's their provider. And yeah,
that's not something that happens here, of just third-party metadata. It's very in-house.
Okay. That is interesting, because third-party metadata is really such an important factor in North America. Yeah.
So here's just, I guess, a general curiosity question that comes from no one apparently. But to the best of your knowledge, if discovery layers for catalogs in Canada or anywhere else, if any discovery layer has the ability to properly and clearly display WEMI relationships to users. Yeah.
Not that I've seen.
Exactly. It's one of those things I'm like, oh.
Yeah, exactly. But please develop one.
Right. And so we have, I think, just to close this out, because I also, again, I don't want to take more of your time, but we do have a lovely question from Caio Batista da Silva, which she says, please, could you tell us about the new edition of your book and where it's available?
Well, yes, that was an interesting thing, because RDA has changed so much that it has the same title as the original, but it's quite different. It's not really an updated edition. It's quite different. Yeah, that's a good question. I imagine, I know that it's available at the ALA bookstore, but I actually have never tried to look for the book, so I don't know.
Right, yeah, you already have it. It's in your brain.
So that's a very good question, but
top-notch team of librarians that are watching this this live stream can figure it out, hopefully.
That's right. Yeah, and what I try to do is just give some of the basics. It's not a training manual. It's just trying to give you some of the ideas, and so because so much comes from IFLA LRM, there's quite a bit on the bibliographic conceptual models, and then some of these really new kind of ideas like representative expression, manifestation statements. So some of those are sort of treated along with some of the nuts and bolts in the toolkit, but again, it doesn't replace a real training, but sometimes it can be useful, to have this background information. Then you see a demo of the toolkit, or you take a training series, and it just, just to give you that background before you plunge in.
I guess, out of curiosity, are the demos and the workshops and things like that, they're only available in English, right? The translations.
They're so excited. They just announced there's an RDA toolkit demo in Spanish and in French coming out in the next couple of months.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so that will be very exciting.
Yeah,
and maybe you could do one for Portuguese.
I can try.
I mean, certainly, if you're interested, I can put you in touch with James Henley, and
that would be perfect. We can talk off mic about this. I do, just some housekeeping for the Brazilians watching us. IFLA LRM is translated into Portuguese. It has been translated last year, and it's available on the IFLA website, and it has been linked in the Portuguese translations of the slides, just because we're talking about clarifying documents and translations.
And that already helps you with the translation of RDA into Portuguese, because so much terminology comes from IFLA LRM. So that's a good starting place.
Exactly. I think that's it. I think that's a good stopping point. And I will bug you later. Just for my super specific questions. But Chris, this has been amazing and super insightful. Again, I want to thank you so much for being here and for giving us a little bit of RDA after 3R for us Brazilians.
Well, it was an incredible honor to be invited. So wonderful, and please feel free, to ask questions. Keep asking questions, and with Google Translate, if you ask it in Portuguese, I might be able to figure it out, and I try my best. Or if not, I'll contact Louisa, and she'll tell me. And so, but I'd love to continue the dialogue on RDA.
Perfect. I think that's it.
Great. Thank you.
Not sure how we end the transmission, but I guess we just leave. So again, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Bye all.